Picture this. You're on a wind-beaten island, far from everything. No cities, no armies, no throne, just the sea, endless, grey, and suffocating. It crashes like a whispering executioner against black volcanic cliffs, and the air smells of damp stone and rotting wood. Somewhere inland, tucked into the belly of the island, like a dying organ, is a crumbling manor called Longwood House. Too grand for a prisoner, too decayed for a king. Inside, the former master of Europe is wasting away. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the terror of monarchies, the shaper of borders, the self-crowned emperor of France, now lies in a small wooden bed, gasping like a man drowning in his own body. His face, once immortalized in marble busts and battlefield legends, is pale and swollen. His belly has distended grotesquely. He can no longer walk without assistance, and when he tries to write, his hand trembles so violently that the pen scratches the paper like a dying insect. He no longer writes letters of war, only quiet pleas to a world that has forgotten him. The room around him is stained with moisture. The wallpaper peels in long curling strips. Mold creeps along the edges of his ceiling. The windows are sealed shut to keep out the storm wind, but the stench of his failing body has nowhere to go. Every breath he takes is shared with the ghosts of his empire, the blood of Austerlitz, the snow of Moscow, the smoke of Waterloo. They haunt him now, more real than the British guards who monitor him like a dangerous animal in a failing zoo. He wakes up screaming at night, sometimes from pain, sometimes from memory. And yet, even in these final days, as his organs rot and his mind frays, there are still moments when something sharp flickers behind his eyes. He's still calculating, still angry, still holding court in his imagination, where armies obey him and maps bend to his will. But no one listens anymore. The world has moved on. France has restored its monarchy. His name is whispered only in fear or mockery. His own son has been taken and turned against him. And the British, his final captors, have ensured that no visitors, no newspapers, and no escape will ever reach him here. He is utterly alone, dying, forgotten. But what happens to a man who once ruled the world when the world decides he no longer matters? The story you're about to hear is not one of battlefield glory or political intrigue. It's something much darker. This is the slow, humiliating collapse of one of history's most powerful men. A final chapter written not in blood or gold, but in bile, hallucinations, and rot. This is how Napoleon Bonaparte truly died. The wind has a particular kind of violence on this island. It doesn't whistle. It howls, long, low, and guttural, like some ancient god exhaling over rock. The sea below thrashes white against black cliffs, and the sky above is a ceiling of mold and bruise. Somewhere on that ragged edge of the world, behind iron-barred windows and rotting shutters, a man is dying. His face is bloated. His legs no longer fit into his boots. His breath comes in short, wet gasps that stink of bile. And yet his mind drifts, not toward God nor peace, but toward something else, toward battlefields, crowds, applause, toward a throne made of cannons and crowned with smoke. This is how the Emperor of France ends, not in glory, but in mildew. But to understand how such a man, the most feared figure in Europe, the conqueror of kings, the self-crowned Caesar of the modern age, ended up here, on a wind-lashed volcanic rock, 6,000 miles from the world he once ruled, we must step back. Not far, just a few years, just far enough to see him fall. The spiral begins in 1812, in the snowfields of Russia, where frostbitten corpses marked the path of Napoleon's ambition like breadcrumbs left for vultures. His grand armée, 600,000 strong, had entered Moscow, with songs on their lips. Fewer than 100,000 staggered back. Russia wasn't just a military defeat, it was a spiritual one. The illusion of invincibility was shattered. The aura of destiny peeled away like flesh from frostbite. After that, the cracks spread fast. Former allies turned enemies. Prussia, Austria, Sweden, each once cowed by his victory, now emboldened by his failure. The Battle of Leipzig in 1813 was the beginning of the end. By the spring of 1814, his enemies were on the outskirts of Paris. Napoleon's marshals, men who had once ridden through fire for him, now begged him to surrender. He did not go quietly. When told he must abdicate, he tried to take his own life, swallowing poison hidden in the folds of his coat, but it had degraded over time. Instead of death, he vomited for hours, retching on the stone floor of Fontainebleau, while the empire he built collapsed like wet parchment. He was exiled, not to St. Helena, not yet, but to Elba, a Mediterranean speck off the coast of Italy. His enemies thought it a suitable cage for a man who once ruled 20 nations, but Elba was too close, too familiar, too easy to escape. He spent only 10 months there. In 1815 he returned, not as a general, but as a myth. When the French army was sent to arrest him, they didn't fire. They joined him, and so began the 100 Days. For a brief moment, Europe trembled again. Napoleon marched on Paris, reclaimed his title, reassembled an army. He was back, and with him came the fear. But it was already too late. Waterloo was waiting. In June 1815, the fields of Belgium drank deep. Rain muddied the ground, and fate slipped from beneath his feet. The battle was brutal, but decisive. And this time, there would be no more Elbas, no more warnings. He surrendered to the British, expecting honor, perhaps even asylum. But Britain had no intention of letting him near Europe again. The world had been burned by him once. They would not risk a second fire, so they chose a place no man could reach and no myth could escape. St. Helena, a prison in the shape of an island, surrounded by shark-filled waters and monitored by warships at all hours, a place of fog, rock, and rot. A place so remote, even whispers took months to arrive. They sent him there like a ghost into exile, and there, in a house built for nobody, the Emperor of Europe began to decay, slowly, brutally, and very much alive. The ship that carried him across the ocean felt less like a vessel and more like a coffin. Day after day he stood on deck, with the salt wind carving lines into his face, watching the sea stretch endlessly, hoping, perhaps, that some sudden squall might swallow the whole damn thing. But no such mercy came, only the slow approach of the island, black rock, rising from a grey sea, a jagged tooth of land, anchored in nothingness. St. Helena. When he arrived, even the geography mocked him. The harbour was a narrow inlet, flanked by cliffs that looked like broken battlements. The air was thick with mildew and loneliness. Locals watched him disembark with a mixture of awe and fear, as if expecting lightning to strike the earth where he stepped. He was no longer emperor, but something more unsettling, a living myth in a place built to erase myths. His new home was Longwood House, perched high on a damp plateau where fog clung like rot. It had once been a modest farmhouse, barely fit for livestock, and now it was to be his palace. The walls oozed moisture. The floorboards warped and creaked. Mold bloomed on the ceilings like black constellations. The wind crept through every crack, chilling him at night and rattling the shutters like angry spirits. He called it a stable, not a residence, and yet it was here that he would spend the last years of his life. It was here that he would unravel. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, ensured that he would never forget his fall. A petty man with a soldier's discipline and a bureaucrat's cruelty, Lowe saw himself not as a jailer, but as a warden of history. His mission was clear: prevent escape, restrict contact, and above all, humiliate. He insisted on referring to Napoleon only as General Bonaparte, a deliberate strip of title, honor, and dignity. Napoleon refused to respond to letters addressed in this way. He would rather remain silent than recognize a lesser name. Their battles were not fought with armies, but with paper. Lowe cut off his mail, limited his visitors, assigned spies to monitor every step he took. When Napoleon complained, Lowe denied it all, with the cold efficiency of a man hiding behind protocol. It wasn't just confinement, it was psychological warfare. Napoleon tried to reclaim control in the only way he could, routine. Each morning he dressed meticulously in full uniform, as if he might be summoned back to court at any moment. He walked the grounds like they were his empire, pacing the same muddy paths again and again until they turned to trenches. He read obsessively, dictated his memoirs to loyal followers, rewrote the story of his life in florid, defiant prose. He was building a fortress out of memory. But the fortress had cracks. The rain seeped in. The mildew ate through books. Insects nested in his bed sheets. The ceiling dripped. And as time passed, the island grew smaller. Its cliffs steeper. Its air heavier. The man who had once redrawn the map of Europe was now confined to a few acres of damp stone, and even within that space, he was not free. He could not walk beyond the fences without British supervision. He could not speak to locals without permission. Even his food arrived under watch, sometimes deliberately late, cold or missing altogether. He suspected poisoning, whether out of paranoia or precognition, no one can say. He began to deteriorate, slowly, then all at once. His skin grew sallow, his eyes dulled. He complained of stomach pain, nausea, fatigue. But the island had no real physicians, just army doctors with leeches and bleeding bowls, men more concerned with orders than treatment. He begged for better care. Lowe refused. And all the while, outside the walls of Longwood, the ocean murmured. No ships came, no letters arrived, no armies marched. The world had moved on. Inside, time began to rot. He slept during the day and paced at night. He talked less, ate less, sat for hours staring at maps of battles long over, eyes tracing lines as if trying to redraw fate. He was not dead, but he was no longer entirely alive. St. Helena was never meant to kill him quickly. It was designed to make him forget the sound of drums, forget the cheers of cities, forget who he had once been, to rot not just the body, but the memory. And slowly, day by day, it was working. At first it was just discomfort, a tightness in the belly after meal, a strange fatigue that clung to him like a second skin. But on St. Helena, nothing remained small for long. Pain had room to stretch, to ferment, and so did paranoia. He told his companions the island's air was toxic, that the dampness was poison, that even the very food might be laced with something slow, colorless, and patient. The symptoms deepened. What began as mild cramps became violent, twisting spasms. He could no longer eat without vomiting. His skin yellowed. His eyes sank into bruised sockets. Some days his legs swelled so much he couldn't walk to the window. He complained of a constant burning in his stomach, a gnawing void as if something inside him was trying to chew its way out. The British physicians stationed on the island, more suited for battlefield wounds than complex internal decay, were equal parts confused and indifferent. Their methods were crude and their remedies cruel. They prescribed wine-soaked cloths for his fever. They bled him with dull instruments, claiming the blood would balance his humours. One afternoon he lost nearly a pint, left pale and shivering in soaked sheets, while flies gathered in the corners of the room. He begged for a proper doctor, someone with experience beyond the scalpel and the leech, someone from Europe. But Lowe refused, said it was unnecessary, said Napoleon was exaggerating, manipulating, and always trying to turn illness into advantage. So the sickness spread. He developed ulcers that wept through his underclothes. His breath began to stink of metal and rot. His mouth turned dry, tongue white, and cracked, teeth loose in bleeding gums. The pain in his stomach came in waves so intense he would bite his knuckles until they bled. At night his groans echoed through the halls of Longwood House, a sound that mixed with the wind and the creaking beams to form a kind of ghostly chorus. Servants learned to muffle the walls with blankets. Visitors were turned away, but nothing could contain what was happening to his body. He stopped shaving. His once pristine uniforms hung loose around his shrinking frame. His hands, once used to grip sabres and sign treaties, trembled too much to hold a fork. He soiled himself more than once. Each accident stripped away another layer of dignity. He started refusing to be seen altogether, ashamed of what he had become. Mirrors were covered, lights dimmed, the curtains remained shut. The emperor was dissolving, quietly, shamefully, inside his own tomb. And still the pain came. He began to believe there were spies inside the house, men slipping poison into his tea, dusting arsenic into his wine. He ordered his food to be tasted, then refused to eat it anyway. Some historians later found traces of arsenic in locks of his hair, though whether it was murder or mere medicine is still debated. On St. Helena, even the facts rot into speculation. He found no relief, only a slow slide into greater agony. His abdomen bloated, distending like a corpse left too long in the sun. Pressure built behind his ribs. At times he screamed, not words, just pure primal noise, the kind that tears from the throat like flesh from bone. By now the physicians had begun keeping journals. Their notes read like those of butchers observing spoiled meat. Foul odor in excretions, abdomen tight and distended, vomitus dark, resembling coffee grounds, a euphemism for dried blood. They tried poultices, purgatives, emetics. They tried more bleeding. They gave him antimony, mercury, opium. Every dose a gamble, every morning another coin, tossed into the well of a dying body. At one point his legs went numb. He thought it might be paralysis. It was actually edema, fluid collecting where life no longer flowed. His feet turned a deep purple, swollen beyond recognition. The sheets stuck to his skin. Each time they were peeled away, they took tissue with them. He began to hallucinate, not with the madness of the mind, but with the clarity of someone drifting between worlds. He spoke to people who weren't there, whispered orders to invisible generals. Sometimes he simply stared at the ceiling and wept. And yet, there were still moments when he tried to hold on, to dress, to sit upright, to recite fragments of his life's triumphs. He would ask for his maps, spread them across the bed, and trace old campaigns with fingers that no longer had strength to press down. He could no longer command an army, but he could still command memory. But even memory was turning on him. He forgot names, faces, dates. One afternoon, he asked a servant what month it was. Another day, he mistook one of his companions for his long-dead brother. His grip on reality frayed like the cuffs of his once glorious uniform. By now, even the British could see it. The man was dying. But how do you kill a symbol? How do you bury a myth? The answer was simple. You let it rot in the dark, slowly, publicly, until all that remains is a body, broken, bloated, and beyond recognition. And when that body breathes its last, you bring your knives, you peel back the skin, you open the stomach, and you write down what you find inside. Because what came next was not peace, it was dissection. By the time spring arrived, the island had begun to dissolve into illusion. Napoleon no longer trusted the landscape. The cliffs seemed to shift. The hallways of Longwood grew longer, then shorter. Doors that once led to the drawing room now opened into darkness. The fog outside pressed harder against the windows, like a living thing desperate to get in, or perhaps trying to keep something in. Sleep abandoned him first, then reason. He would lie awake for days at a time, propped up by pillows and sweat-drenched sheets, eyes wide and glassy, staring at the warped ceiling beams like they were battle lines. He began speaking to the shadows, sometimes in Italian, sometimes in Corsican, sometimes in French, so broken it barely resembled speech. He whispered to people long dead, Berthier, Murat, Josephine. At times he held court with no one in the room. Some nights he would rise, trembling, and attempt to dress himself, convinced he was late for an imperial procession. He called for his hat, his sword, his gloves. He screamed at his valet for failing to press his uniform. His thin frame sagged in the fabric, like a child playing emperor in a dead man's clothes. He forgot where he was. He forgot when he was. One afternoon, he ordered his servants to prepare the carriage for Moscow. Another time, he declared war on England again, and began dictating a letter to the Tsar. He thought he was in Paris, then Vienna, then Corsica. Reality had broken into shards, and each moment cut him anew. Even his body joined in the betrayal. He began to see things, insects crawling beneath his skin, a black dog watching him from the corner of the room, faces in the wallpaper. He insisted they were spies, that they moved when he blinked, that they spoke in riddles. He once tried to tear apart his mattress, convinced it was stuffed with English listening devices. The hallucinations grew more elaborate. At sunset, when the light turned copper and the shadows grew long, he would fall into trances that lasted hours. He murmured about Austerlitz, about Marengo, about the pyramids of Egypt. He refought entire battles from memory, hands twitching as though conducting troops across invisible terrain. When servants tried to interrupt, he lashed out, called them traitors, accused them of sabotage. Then, moments later, he would apologize, crying like a child, clutching their hands and begging them not to leave. There was no longer any privacy in his mind, no sanctuary. He was haunted not only by ghosts, but by possibilities, alternate outcomes that rewrote his failures. He spoke of turning the tide at Waterloo, of an alliance with Russia that had never been, of a Europe united under his code, not just in law, but in love. His voice would trail off, and he would stare into nothing, eyes wet with dreams. They brought in priests, not to save his soul, but to give structure to his madness. He would listen politely, nodding at scriptures, then ask if God had ever crossed the Alps in winter, if the saints had ever held a continent in their hands, if Christ too had been betrayed by his marshals. And then came the dreams, thick, endless waves of them. He would wake screaming, drenched in sweat, clutching at his chest as if something inside him were trying to claw its way out. He said he saw Josephine, but not as she had been in life. No, not beautiful, not smiling, but hollow-eyed and bloodless, floating outside the window with her hands pressed against the glass. He spoke of her constantly, asked if she had written, if she had forgiven him. Sometimes he believed she was in the room with him. He would talk to an empty chair for hours, weeping and laughing, apologizing again and again. As his body failed, his mind drifted further from the shore. The once great general now spent entire afternoons counting his fingers, mumbling numbers that never added up. When he spoke to visitors, he demanded to know the state of the empire. They didn't have the heart to tell him there was no empire, only history. But perhaps the most terrifying part wasn't the screaming, or the delusions, or the hallucinations. It was the lucidity that returned in flashes, brief moments when the fog cleared and he remembered everything. The weight of failure, the loss of his son, the sound of hooves on wet earth at Waterloo, the thousands who died for his ambition, the cities he burned, the lives he reshaped and shattered. He would fall silent then, sit still, staring at his own hands as if they didn't belong to him. And then the madness would return, wrapping itself around him like a shroud, pulling him back into the theatre of memory and ghosts, into the noise and drums of a war long over, into an empire that lived only in his mind. Outside, the wind blew harder across the cliffs of St. Helena. The shutters rattled like bones, and inside Longwood House, the Emperor slipped further from the world, one broken thought at a time. But death was no longer far behind. It was standing just outside the door, waiting patiently, ready to finish what madness had begun. On the morning of May the 5th, 1821, the silence in Longwood was different, heavy, absolute. The wind had stilled, the rain had stopped. Even the ever-present creak of rotting wood seemed to hold its breath. Inside the bedroom, the smell was unbearable, a sour mix of sweat, decay, and something metallic that clung to the throat. Napoleon lay motionless, sheets damp against his wasted frame, his face sunken and grey. His breathing had slowed to a whisper, shallow gasps barely lifting his chest. His lips were cracked, his eyes half-lidded, darting beneath thin skin, as though chasing dreams down dark corridors. His companions gathered by the bedside, Montholon, Bertrand, Marchand. They stood like mourners already, but none dared speak. They knew what was coming. They had watched it crawl toward him for months. They had heard the screams, seen the blood in his vomit, watched the emperor lose his empire, one breath at a time. A priest stood nearby, whispering final prayers, the same rites that had once echoed through cathedrals, now reduced to this, murmured over a dying man in a mold-ridden room on the edge of the world. Napoleon did not respond. He was past language, past command. At 5:49 p.m. he exhaled and did not inhale again. No final words, no grand declarations, just silence. The emperor was gone, and yet death was not the end, not for a man like Napoleon, not when power leaves behind a corpse. Within hours, the autopsy was arranged. The British insisted. It wasn't curiosity, it was paranoia. Rumors of poisoning had already begun to swirl. They wanted proof, something definitive, something they could point to and say, this was nature, not murder. So they cut him open. The body was laid out on a long wooden table in the dining room, the table where he had once sipped wine and told stories of conquest. Now it was an altar of flesh. His chest was split open, his stomach dissected. The doctors worked with solemn precision, but there was something grotesque in the air, something voyeuristic, as if by opening the body they might unlock the myth itself. What they found was horrifying. The stomach was a ruined landscape, ulcerated, blackened, nearly dissolved in places. The walls were thick and puckered. At its center, a large cancerous mass, bleeding and rotted. They noted the smell, rank, overwhelming, like death soaked in acid. One surgeon, pale and trembling, gagged and had to leave the room. It wasn't just cancer. It was annihilation from the inside out. The organ that had digested his banquets, his battlefield rations, his ceremonial feasts, had turned against him, had consumed itself. Some of the surrounding tissue had begun to fuse to neighboring organs. His liver, too, was swollen and diseased, his lungs filled with fluid. There were traces of poison, but arsenic had been a common ingredient in medicines of the time. It could have come from tonics, wine, even hair products, or it could have come from somewhere else. The British were quick to declare natural causes, stomach cancer. A cruel irony, perhaps, for a man who had once consumed continents. They took detailed notes, preserved specimens in alcohol, sealed his body in 4 coffins, tin, mahogany, lead, and another mahogany, layer upon layer, as if trying to contain what he had once been. But the autopsy did not quiet the rumors, it amplified them. There were whispers that the British had tampered with the findings, that the physician had lied, that the real cause of death was poisoning, administered slowly over months, just enough to let the cancer seem plausible. Others claimed the French had faked the cancer diagnosis to shield their emperor from scandal, to preserve the dignity of the myth. Even his penis was reportedly removed during the autopsy, though no one ever agreed on who took it or why. Some say it was stolen by a priest, others that it passed through collectors like a relic, a fragment of a god who died like a man. Back in Paris, crowds gathered in cafes, arguing over the manner of his death. In Vienna, London, St. Petersburg, everyone had an opinion. Did the British kill him? Did his own body betray him? Did he die a martyr, a tyrant, a victim of fate? In Longwood, his companions wept quietly. Whatever else he had been, monster, genius, liberator, dictator, he had been their leader, their sun. And now that sun had set, leaving only shadows. His room was sealed, the bed stripped, the maps folded, the silence returned. And outside, on the cliffs of St. Helena, the sea moved as it always had, indifferent, endless. The body was barely cold before the second death began, not of flesh, but of narrative, of memory, the rewriting of a man into myth, and then into something else entirely. Napoleon's corpse lay in its coffin on St. Helena, but across Europe his image was already being embalmed in words. The British, for their part, were eager to control the story. Official statements declared that the former emperor had died peacefully, surrounded by dignity and care of natural causes, in a place more comfortable than the public ever imagined. They published reports of his fine meals, his personal comfort, his courteous conversations with the guards. They emphasized how just and humane his captors had been, a well-fed lion, gently caged. But those who had seen Longwood knew better. They had smelled the rot, heard the screams, watched the man waste into a husk of what he had been. And so the story began to split. The French exiles who had remained with him published memoirs that painted a different picture of isolation, of intentional neglect, of psychological torture. They spoke of the damp walls, the hostile governor, the slow medical indifference. They claimed he had been poisoned, slowly, carefully. A second assassination masked his illness. Meanwhile, Napoleon's supporters in France, Bonapartists scattered and silenced after Waterloo, found in his death a new weapon. The man they had followed into endless war, who had buried an entire generation beneath imperial ambition, was now recast as a victim, not of battle, but of betrayal. The same England that had once trembled before his armies had now starved him to death, alone and forgotten on a wet volcanic rock. This was no tyrant, they said. This was Prometheus, punished for daring to shape the world. Pamphlets began to circulate. Lithographs were drawn of the emperor in his bed, pale but noble, draped in imperial linens, a halo of martyrdom forming around his head. Artists reimagined St. Helena not as a prison, but as a Golgotha. The island itself became a cross. They erased the madness, the screaming, the hallucinations, the nights soaked in bile. In their stories he spoke final words with clarity. He forgave, he reflected, he transcended, and Paris, still bruised from Bourbon restoration, began to murmur. The people, who had once cheered his downfall, now whispered his name again, with a kind of guilty reverence. Napoleon, the man who brought Europe to its knees, had suffered. He had been caged, humiliated, and ultimately destroyed, not by gunpowder, but by indifference. That made him human again. And then something even stranger happened. His enemies began to mourn him too. Wellington, his old nemesis, reportedly expressed sorrow. Other European leaders, once his fiercest rivals, spoke with grudging admiration. They had feared him alive, but now that he was safely dead, they could afford to respect him. Death had declawed him. He was no longer a threat, just a memory, one that could be shaped like clay. Within a decade, writers began to repurpose his life into allegory. Poets turned his rise and fall into tragedy. Historians sifted through the contradictions and chose which parts to keep. Some called him a monster, others a savior, a revolutionary who became a king who called himself a soldier who ruled like a god and died like a man. He was packaged, sold, enshrined. By the time his body was returned to France in 1840, 19 years after his death, the transformation was complete. The British handed over the remains with ceremony, eager to rid themselves of the myth that had begun to fester in their own soil. In Paris, a procession awaited. Thousands lined the streets in the cold rain. Women wept, veterans saluted. The Arc de Triomphe stood silent witness as the coffin passed beneath. They no longer remembered the madman screaming at shadows on St. Helena. They remembered Austerlitz. They remembered the eagle. They remembered the dream. They buried him beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, not as a prisoner of war, but as a god returned home. It was the final act of erasure, because to make Napoleon immortal, they had to kill him again. Not the body this time, but the truth. So what remains? A name carved in marble, a tomb drenched in gold, a face on coinage, on paintings, on postage stamps, a story told 1,000 ways, each version bending to the needs of the teller. But not the man. The man is gone. What lingers in his place is a contradiction, one so vast and magnetic that it continues to orbit the conscience of history. Was Napoleon a liberator or a tyrant, a genius or a butcher? Did he elevate men or grind them beneath his boots? Was he a monster formed by revolution or the last true emperor of Rome in disguise. It depends on where you begin the story. It depends on whether you end it in glory or in a dark, damp room at the edge of the world, whispering to ghosts. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Napoleon's greatest conquest was not Europe, but narrative itself. He understood that legacy is a weapon, more powerful than any cannon. That myth, properly shaped, outlives flesh, outlives shame, outlives even the smell of rot in a shuttered room. In life, he was obsessed with staging, with how history would remember him. He edited his own memoirs, rewrote battles in letters, had portraits altered to emphasize divine light over human flaw. He named himself emperor, not just of France, but of memory. He believed in the permanence of will, but history does not remember the way we want it to. It remembers how it must, frayed at the edges, full of contradiction, shaped as much by silence as by story. Napoleon wanted to be Caesar, to be Alexander. Instead, he became something more elusive, a mirror. We see in him what we need to see. Some see ambition, some see madness, some see a cautionary tale of what happens when one man seizes too much. But look closer, and you'll see something smaller, something sadder. You'll see a young man from Corsica, half French, half outsider, desperate to matter, desperate to prove that he could bend history to his name. And for a time, he did. He redrew maps, toppled kings, made the world hold its breath. But power is a spiral. You rise by force, but you stay by illusion. And the higher you climb, the thinner the air, until one day the empire you built becomes the prison you can't escape. Until the armies are gone, the flags are burned, and the only thing left standing is your story. He wanted to be eternal, but eternity is a slow forgetting. And maybe that's why he clung so desperately to memory, even as he lost his own. Why he shouted battle orders to empty rooms. Why he called for Josephine when she had long been dust. He wasn't just afraid of death, he was afraid of erasure. And maybe in that way he succeeded. Because here we are, 2 centuries later, still speaking his name, still walking through the ruins he left behind, still haunted by the ghost of a man who believed the world could be folded into the palm of one hand. Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor, the exile, the dreamer, the monster, the myth. He died on an island, but he lives in a question. What happens to a man who conquers the world only to lose himself? There is no final answer, only echoes.